You can't evict me from my own property, Patricia. I said it calmly, almost kindly, while manure still clung to my boots and the morning sun painted everything gold. She blinked twice, clutching that ridiculous envelope like it was a loaded weapon, her frosted pink lips forming a tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes. The look on her face, that absolute certainty that she'd finally won, was the same expression I'd seen on 100 power-drunk HOA presidents before her, right before their entire world came crashing down. But we'll get to that. Right now, you need to understand exactly how we got here, standing on opposite sides of a wrought iron gate that's older than both of us combined, with her holding an eviction notice that wasn't worth the embossed paper it was printed on. Where are you watching this from? Suburbia? A townhouse with an HOA breathing down your neck? And you already know this story. You've lived pieces of it. But I promise you've never seen it end quite like this. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into Patricia Vanderholm's personal crusade to erase my family's legacy from the map. The day started the way most ranch mornings do, before dawn with the smell of hay and horse feed, the sound of crickets fading into birdsong, and the kind of quiet that only exists before the rest of the world wakes up and ruins everything. I've been back home for 6 months, living in a foreman's cottage on the eastern edge of the property, trying to figure out if I could make this work long-term or if I'd eventually have to go back to Washington, D.C. and my windowless office at the Federal Housing Oversight Commission. My official title was Deputy Director of Compliance and Enforcement, which sounds impressive until you realize it means I spend most of my time reading HOA bylaws, investigating complaints about neighborhood associations that have gone rogue, and writing policy recommendations that get ignored by Congress. Thrilling stuff, but coming home had reminded me why I'd stayed away so long. The ranch wasn't just different now. It was surrounded, strangled, suffocated by Meadowbrook Estates, a sprawling subdivision of 240 identical homes that have metastasized around my family's property like a particularly aggressive form of suburban cancer. Every house the same shade of beige, every lawn cut to exactly 2.5 inches, every mailbox regulation black with brass numbers, every driveway pressure washed every other Sunday, and every single property owner living under the iron fist of an HOA that had more rules than the actual federal government I worked for. Patricia had moved into Meadowbrook Estates 3 years ago, fresh off a messy divorce and a failed real estate career in Phoenix. She joined the HOA board within 6 months, became president within a year, and spent the next 2 years transforming a relatively reasonable neighborhood association into her personal fiefdom. I'd heard the stories from my father before he passed, how she had driven out the previous board members, how she had rewritten the bylaws to give herself essentially unlimited power, how she had created an enforcement committee that was really just her and 2 retired accountants who did whatever she said. But I'd been too busy with work, too buried in other people's HOA problems to pay attention to what was happening in my own backyard. That changed the first time I got a violation notice. It arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered by Patricia herself, who had driven her golf cart right up to my door like she owned the place. The notice claimed my barn, the same barn my grandfather built in 1952, the same barn that appeared in county historical records, the same barn that had weathered 70 decades of Arizona summers, was painted in a non-compliant color scheme that violated Meadowbrook Estates architectural guidelines. She wanted it repainted to match the community's approved palette. She gave me 14 days. The fine for non-compliance was $500, accumulating daily. I remember standing there in my doorway, reading this thing, waiting for the punchline. My property wasn't even part of her HOA. The ranch predated Meadowbrook Estates by half a century. We weren't bound by their covenants, their bylaws, their architectural review committee, or any of the 200 pages of rules Patricia enforced like scripture. I was what's called a legacy property, land that existed before the subdivision, grandfathered in, completely separate from their association. I tried to explain this to her, politely, professionally. I even pulled out the property records, the survey maps, the documentation proving my land was independent. Patricia just smiled that smile, the one where the lips curve up but the eyes stay dead, and told me that recent legal review had determined my property was actually within HOA jurisdiction due to shared infrastructure and community impact considerations. She said it like she was reading from a script, which she probably was, because Patricia wasn't smart enough to come up with that kind of legal-sounding nonsense. That's when I knew this wasn't just bureaucratic confusion. This was targeted, deliberate. Patricia had decided my ranch was a problem, probably because it was the only property in the entire area that didn't bow to her authority, and she was going to fix that problem by any means necessary. The second violation notice came a few days later, then a third, then a fourth, each one more absurd than the last, each one carrying bigger fines, each one citing community standards that had been invented specifically to target my property. My horses created agricultural nuisance odors. My century-old oak tree dropped excessive organic debris that impacted neighborhood aesthetics. My split-rail fence was inconsistent with community design expectations. Even my gravel driveway, the same driveway that had been there before Patricia was born, was suddenly a non-conforming surface material violation. I could have stopped it then. One phone call to my office, one email to our legal department, one formal complaint filed through proper channels, and Patricia's little reign of terror would have ended before it started. But here's the thing about spending 20 years investigating HOA abuse. You develop a certain patience for watching bad actors hang themselves. You learn to let them escalate, to document everything, to give them enough rope and then some. Because the bigger they swing, the harder they fall. And Patricia was winding up for the swing of her life. Which brings us back to that Tuesday morning with the eviction notice. She had arrived just after 7, her golf cart humming up to my gate like an electric chariot of suburban justice. She was dressed for victory, white capri pants, a turquoise blazer, designer sunglasses pushed up into her professionally highlighted hair. She had her phone out, probably recording, definitely expecting a scene. The envelope she handed me through the gate bars was thick, official-looking, sealed with an actual wax stamp bearing the Meadowbrook Estates logo. Official Notice of Eviction and Property Seizure. The header read in font so formal it looked like a presidential decree. Pursuant to HOA Covenant Enforcement Section 14.7, Eminent Domain Provisions and Community Welfare Protection Protocols. I read the first paragraph, then the second. Then I started laughing, and I couldn't stop. "This is a legal document," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You might want to take it seriously." "Oh, I'm taking it very seriously," I managed between laughs. "This is the most illegal thing I've read all month, and trust me, I read illegal things for a living." Her expression flickered, just for a second, just enough to let me know she wasn't quite as confident as she was pretending to be. But she recovered fast, pulling herself up straighter, adjusting her blazer like she was wearing armor instead of overpriced polyester. "You have 30 days to vacate the property and surrender your property rights to Meadowbrook Estates HOA for the purposes of community development and standards enforcement." She recited it like she had practiced in the mirror. "This is happening, Sarah. You can fight it and lose everything, or you can accept the inevitable and take the settlement we're offering you." Settlement? That was a new word. I flipped to the last page and saw the number. $125,000 for 47 acres of prime property that was worth at least 20 times that. "Who wrote this for you?" I asked, genuinely curious, because whoever they were, they just violated about 17 different federal housing laws. "My lawyer is either incompetent or you didn't tell them the truth about my property status." I folded the eviction notice and handed it back to her through the gate. "I'm not accepting this. I'm not complying, and I'm definitely not leaving." Patricia's smile never wavered, which should have been my first clue about what was coming next. "That's what I expected you'd say," she said, tucking the envelope back into her designer bag, "which is why the board meeting to finalize your eviction is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. 7 p.m., Meadowbrook Community Center. I strongly suggest you attend." She turned the golf cart around and drove away, and I stood there watching her go, still holding a pitchfork full of horse manure, wondering exactly how far she was planning to take this insanity. Turns out, all the way to federal prison. But she didn't know that yet.
"Your property is a disgrace to this community." Patricia had said it at a town hall meeting 6 months before the eviction notice, standing at a podium with a PowerPoint presentation showing aerial photos of my ranch circled in red like a crime scene. I wasn't even there to defend myself. I was still in D.C., wrapping up a case against an HOA in Maryland that had tried to foreclose on a veteran's home over a $75 late fee. My neighbor texted me a video of Patricia's performance, and I watched it on my phone during my lunch break. Equal parts horrified and fascinated. She had charts. She had graphs. She had testimony from homeowners claiming my property lowered their home values by an estimated 12 to 18%. She even had a petition with 147 signatures demanding the HOA take action against the eyesore disrupting their community's aesthetic harmony. The ranch she was describing sounded like a junkyard. Ramshackle buildings, overgrown vegetation, abandoned equipment rusting in the sun. The photos she showed were real. My property, taken from the street, but they were cropped, angled, filtered to make everything look as decrepit as possible. That collapsed structure was actually my grandfather's original chicken coop, partially dismantled because I'd been salvaging the vintage wood. That hazardous debris pile was lumber I'd organized for fence repairs. That uncontrolled vegetation was a wildflower meadow I'd deliberately maintained for the bees. But context doesn't matter when you're building a narrative, and Patricia was building a masterpiece. Let me tell you how we got here, because this didn't start with Patricia Venderholm. This started 15 years ago when my father got the first letter from Sunbelt Development Corporation offering to buy our ranch for fair market value plus 20%. He laughed and threw it in the trash. They sent another letter, then another. Then they sent a man in a suit who showed up at our door with a briefcase full of contracts and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. My father told him to leave and never come back. The man left, the letter stopped, and 6 months later construction began on the Thompson farm next door. Old man Thompson had sold out. 340 acres to Sunbelt Development for enough money to retire to Florida and never think about Arizona dust again. I don't blame him. He was 83, had no kids who wanted to ranch, and Sunbelt made him an offer that probably felt like winning the lottery. But what came next was something none of us saw coming. They didn't build a neighborhood. They built an empire. Meadowbrook Estates rose from the desert like a beige monument to conformity. 240 homes in the first phase alone, each one identical except for the custom options that amounted to different garage door styles and upgraded kitchen countertops. The streets were named after trees that didn't exist in Arizona: Maple Grove Lane, Birch Hollow Court, Willow Creek Drive. The landscaping was pure Southwest chic: crushed granite, decorative boulders, and those sad little Palo Verde trees that looked like they were dying even when they were healthy. Every house came with an automatic sprinkler system timed to water at exactly 5 a.m. because God forbid anyone have brown spots visible from the street. And every single property came with mandatory HOA membership, enforceable covenants, and monthly dues that started at $300 and climbed every year like clockwork. My father watched it happen from our front porch, shaking his head every time another foundation got poured, another frame went up, another family moved into their beige palace with their HOA welcome packet and their list of 247 rules about what they could and couldn't do with the property they just mortgaged their lives to own. He used to say Meadowbrook Estates wasn't a neighborhood, it was a cult that charged monthly dues. I thought he was exaggerating. Turns out he was being generous. The first few years were quiet. The HOA left us alone, mostly because they were too busy enforcing rules on their own members. Someone painted their front door the wrong shade of red, $500 fine. Someone planted roses in their front yard without architectural approval, $750 fine, plus mandatory removal. Someone put up a basketball hoop in their driveway. Emergency board meeting, threatened lawsuit, hoop removed within 48 hours. I heard the stories through my father, who heard them from the contractors and delivery drivers that serviced both the ranch and the subdivision. The HOA was strict, sure, but it was their problem, not ours. Then Patricia moved in. She bought a house on Sycamore Ridge Circle in November 3 years ago, right after her divorce from some Phoenix real estate developer who had apparently decided he'd rather pay alimony than spend another year married to her. The neighborhood gossip, and there was always gossip, said she'd walked away with enough money to buy her house outright, plus a generous monthly stipend that let her live comfortably without actually working. What she didn't walk away with was purpose, identity, or anything resembling self-awareness. So she found it in the HOA. She joined the board in March, 6 months after moving in. She ran on a platform of restoring community standards and protecting property values, which are HOA code words for "I'm going to make everyone's life miserable and call it public service." She won by 14 votes, mostly because only 47 people bothered to show up to the election, and half of them voted for her just because she'd personally knocked on their doors and smiled that predatory smile while promising to clean up the neighborhood. By June, she was president. The previous president, a retired engineer named Ron, who'd actually been reasonable about enforcement, resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons that everyone knew meant "Patricia made my life hell until I quit." The vice president and treasurer followed within weeks. Patricia replaced them with Gary Hoffmeyer and Linda Chen, two retired accountants who'd moved to Meadowbrook specifically for the structured community environment and who treated HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments handed down from a very petty, very suburban God. The transformation was immediate and brutal. Patricia's first act as president was to hire a professional management company, Prestige Community Solutions, one of those firms that specializes in aggressive enforcement protocols and charges exorbitant fees to basically terrorize homeowners into compliance. Her second act was to rewrite the bylaws, expanding the board's authority to include emergency enforcement powers that let them impose fines, initiate legal action, and even place liens on properties without a vote from the general membership. Her third act was to raise the monthly dues from $300 to $425, with the extra money going toward enhanced community standards monitoring and enforcement, which meant Patricia now had a budget to make people's lives miserable, and she spent it like a woman on a mission from God. Suddenly, violation notices were everywhere. Houses that had been perfectly fine for years were now cited for faded paint, slightly overgrown hedges, or mailbox posts that were an inch too short according to some obscure bylaw nobody had ever enforced. Residents who'd lived there peacefully for a decade were suddenly facing thousands of fines for violations they didn't know existed. People started selling their homes just to escape. Property values actually dropped, which was ironic considering her entire platform had been about protecting them. But here's the thing. As long as Patricia was terrorizing her own neighborhood, nobody outside of Meadowbrook Estates cared. It was their problem, their drama, their mistake for buying into an HOA-controlled community in the first place. Then she ran out of internal targets and turned her attention to me. I think it started with the oak tree. My property has this massive, absolutely magnificent, century-old oak tree on the western boundary, right where my land meets the edge of Meadowbrook Estates. It's the kind of tree that takes your breath away, sprawling canopy, trunk wider than a car, and branches that create shade for half an acre. It's also the kind of tree that drops leaves, lots of leaves, especially in the fall when the wind picks up and sends thousands of brown oak leaves tumbling across the desert like nature's confetti. Some of those leaves ended up in Patricia's yard. Her house was 3 properties away from my boundary line, separated by 2 other homes and probably 400 feet of distance. But somehow, impossibly, she claimed that my oak tree was creating a nuisance debris situation that affected her property value and quality of life. She took photos of leaves in her yard. She collected them in bags and labeled them with dates and times like they were evidence in a murder trial. She even hired someone to do a wind pattern analysis that supposedly proved the leaves were coming from my tree and not from any of the desert vegetation that literally surrounded the entire subdivision. She brought it up at a board meeting in September, demanded the HOA take action against the external debris source. Gary and Linda nodded along like trained seals. The board voted to send me a formal complaint letter requesting I maintain my vegetation to prevent community impact. I ignored it. It wasn't even a legal document, just Patricia's insanity on official letterhead. Then she came to my property in person, driving her golf cart right up to my gate one Saturday morning while I was feeding the horses. She had a file folder thick with documents, photos, and what looked like a legal brief on tree responsibility and boundary disputes. She presented her case like she was arguing before the Supreme Court. My tree was a nuisance, my property was negatively impacting the community, and I had a moral obligation to either trim the tree back to the property line or remove it entirely. I told her the tree was older than both of us combined, and I'd sooner remove my own arm than cut down something my grandfather had planted as a seedling in 1920. She didn't like that answer. Her expression went from fake pleasant to unauthorized shade patterns. I said it out loud, standing in my kitchen with the latest violation notice in one hand and my morning coffee in the other, trying to process the fact that someone had actually typed those words, printed them on official letterhead, and mailed them to me, with a straight face. The citation was dated October 12th, signed by Patricia Vanderhoem in her capacity as HOA President and Chief Enforcement Officer, a title she'd apparently given herself, and included a grainy photograph of my oak tree's shadow stretching across the corner of someone's backyard at approximately 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. According to the notice, my tree was creating unpredictable and unauthorized shade patterns that interfere with approved landscaping solar exposure requirements and violate community aesthetic harmony standards as outlined in Section 23.4.b of the Meadowbrook Estates Architectural Guidelines. Section 23.4.b, for the record, didn't exist. I know because I downloaded the entire Meadowbrook Estates covenant document, all 186 pages of it, and read every single word during a particularly boring conference call about federal housing accessibility standards. The real Section 23.4 was about fence heights. There was no subsection B. There was barely a Section 23 at all. Patricia was making it up as she went along, and she was counting on me being too intimidated, too busy, or too ignorant to call her bluff. She'd severely miscalculated on all three counts. But here's what you need to understand about HOA harassment. And yes, that's what this was, textbook harassment that violated multiple federal fair housing statutes. It's not about being right. It's about being relentless. Patricia wasn't trying to win a legal argument. She was trying to bury me under so much paperwork, so many threats, so many escalating fines that I'd eventually just give up and either comply or leave. It's a war of attrition, and most people don't have the resources, the knowledge, or the sheer stubborn spite to fight back. Lucky for me, I had all three in abundance. The violation notices had started arriving with increasing frequency after my conversation with Patricia at the gate about the oak tree. That first one about excessive organic debris was almost quaint in retrospect. A simple request to maintain vegetation to community standards with a suggested timeline of 30 days and a fine of $250 if I failed to comply. I'd filed it away and forgotten about it, figuring it was just Patricia blowing off steam. The second notice arrived 6 days later. This one was about my barn. The barn my grandfather built in 1952 was a classic post and beam structure made from local timber, painted in traditional barn red with white trim around the doors and windows. It had weathered 70 years of Arizona summers, monsoons, and the occasional dust storm that made the sky turn orange and the world disappear. The paint was original. Faded in some spots, sun-bleached in others, but authentic and beautiful in that way that only old, well-maintained structures can be. It looked like what it was, a working barn on a working ranch, built by a man who knew what he was doing and built things to last. According to Patricia's violation notice, it was an unapproved exterior color scheme that conflicts with community architectural standards and creates visual discord within the established residential aesthetic establishment. The notice demanded I repaint the barn within 14 days using only colors from the approved Meadowbrook Estates palette, a selection of beiges, taups, and what the paint industry generously calls desert neutral tones that all basically amount to different shades of institutional sadness. The fine for non-compliance was $500, accumulating at $100 per day after the deadline. I did the math. If I ignored this notice, Patricia was threatening to fine me $3,000 in the first month alone for not painting a barn that predated her HOA by half a century. The third notice came 4 days after that. Apparently, my horses constituted unapproved agricultural activity in a designated residential zone and created odor nuisance conditions that violated community livability standards. Never mind that my property was zoned agricultural and had been before zoning laws existed in this county. Never mind that my horses were downwind from the subdivision, and Patricia would have needed a bloodhound's nose and a prevailing wind reversal to smell anything from her house. She'd included statements from 3 residents claiming they could smell barnyard odors from their properties. I recognized 2 of the names, Gary Hoffmeyer and Linda Chen, her board lackeys. The third was someone named Deborah Martinez, who lived 4 streets away from my property line and definitely couldn't smell my horses unless they'd evolved the ability to teleport their scent across half a mile of desert. Fine amount, $750, plus a demand that I relocate or remove all livestock within 30 days. Are you keeping track? Because I was. 3 violations in 2 weeks. $1,500 in threatened fines, and demands that would have required me to fundamentally alter or destroy property that had existed peacefully for 70 years before Patricia decided it offended her sensibilities. I could have responded. Should have responded, legally speaking. Most HOA bylaws require you to formally contest violations within a specific time frame or they become final and enforceable. But here's the beautiful thing about Patricia's campaign of harassment, and yes, that's what this was, textbook harassment that violated multiple federal fair housing statutes. It's not about being right. It's about being relentless. Patricia wasn't trying to win a legal argument. She was trying to bury me under so much paperwork, so many threats, so many escalating fines that I'd eventually just give up and either comply or leave. It's a war of attrition. And most people don't have the resources, the knowledge, or the sheer stubborn spite to fight back. Lucky for me, I had all 3 in abundance. The violation notices had started arriving with increasing frequency after my conversation with Patricia at the gate about the oak tree. That first one about excessive organic debris was almost quaint in retrospect. A simple request to maintain vegetation to community standards with a suggested timeline of 30 days and a fine of $250 if I failed to comply. I'd filed it away and forgotten about it, figuring it was just Patricia blowing off steam. The second notice arrived 6 days later. This one was about my barn. The barn my grandfather built in 1952 was a classic post and beam structure made from local timber, painted in traditional barn red with white trim around the doors and windows. It had weathered 70 years of Arizona summers, monsoons, and the occasional dust storm that made the sky turn orange and the world disappear. The paint was original, faded in some spots, sun-bleached in others, but authentic and beautiful in that way that only old, well-maintained structures can be. It looked like what it was, a working barn on a working ranch, built by a man who knew what he was doing and built things to last. According to Patricia's violation notice, it was an unapproved exterior color scheme that conflicts with community architectural standards and creates visual discord within the established residential aesthetic establishment. The notice demanded I repaint the barn within 14 days using only colors from the approved Meadowbrook Estates palette, a selection of beiges, taups, and what the paint industry generously calls desert neutral tones that all basically amount to different shades of institutional sadness. The fine for non-compliance was $500, accumulating at $100 per day after the deadline. I did the math. If I ignored this notice, Patricia was threatening to fine me $3,000 in the first month alone for not painting a barn that predated her HOA by half a century. The third notice came 4 days after that. Apparently, my horses constituted unapproved agricultural activity in a designated residential zone and created odor nuisance conditions that violated community livability standards. Never mind that my property was zoned agricultural and had been before zoning laws existed in this county. Never mind that my horses were downwind from the subdivision, and Patricia would have needed a bloodhound's nose and a prevailing wind reversal to smell anything from her house. She'd included statements from 3 residents claiming they could smell barnyard odors from their properties. I recognized 2 of the names, Gary Hoffmeyer and Linda Chen, her board lackeys. The third was someone named Deborah Martinez, who lived 4 streets away from my property line and definitely couldn't smell my horses unless they'd evolved the ability to teleport their scent across half a mile of desert. Fine amount, $750, plus a demand that I relocate or remove all livestock within 30 days. Are you keeping track? Because I was. 3 violations in 2 weeks. $1,500 in threatened fines and demands that would have required me to fundamentally alter or destroy property that had existed peacefully for 70 years before Patricia decided it offended her sensibilities. I could have responded. Should have responded, legally speaking. Most HOA bylaws require you to formally contest violations within a specific.
Ma'am, we need you to stay back from the survey line. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a safety vest 3 sizes too big and holding a clipboard like it was a shield. Behind him, 2 more crew members were hammering stakes into the ground along my southern fence line, each one marked with orange flagging tape that snapped in the morning breeze. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, November 14th, and I'd woken up to the sound of a diesel truck idling on the easement road that ran along my property boundary. I stood there in my bathrobe and boots, coffee mug in hand, watching 3 strangers plant survey markers on land my family had owned since Truman was president. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. "Whose authorization do you have for this survey?" I asked, keeping my voice level and friendly. Always start with friendly. Gives you room to escalate later. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a safety vest 3 sizes too big and holding a clipboard like it was a shield. Behind them, 2 more crew members were hammering stakes into the ground along my southern fence line, each one marked with orange flagging tape that snapped in the morning breeze. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, November 14th, and I'd woken up to the sound of a diesel truck idling on the easement road that ran along my property boundary. "Ma'am, we need you to stay back from the survey line." The kid couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a safety vest 3 sizes too big and holding a clipboard like it was a shield. Behind him, 2 more crew members were hammering stakes into the ground along my southern fence line, each one marked with orange flagging tape that snapped in the morning breeze. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, November 14th, and I'd woken up to the sound of a diesel truck idling on the easement road that ran along my property boundary. I stood there in my bathrobe and boots, coffee mug in hand, watching 3 strangers plant survey markers on land my family had owned since Truman was president. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. "Whose authorization do you have for this survey?" I asked, keeping my voice level and friendly. Always start with friendly. Gives you room to escalate later. The kid glanced at his clipboard, then at the truck, then at his coworkers, looking for backup that wasn't coming. We were hired by Meadowbrook Estates HOA.
This is standard boundary verification for community property management purposes. Community property. I repeated the words slowly, tasting them. And who told you this was community property? Our work order says we're surveying the southern boundary of HOA common land that's currently encroached upon by an adjacent private property. He read it like he was reciting from a script, which he probably was. We're just doing our job, ma'am. I believed him. These guys were contractors, hired to run a survey based on whatever information Patricia had fed them. They had no idea they were being used as pawns in her increasingly unhinged campaign to steal my property. But ignorance doesn't change the fact that they were on my land, marking boundaries that didn't exist, creating documentation that Patricia would absolutely try to use against me. I need to see your work order, I said, and I need the name of whoever hired you. The kid looked uncomfortable. I can't really. You're surveying property that's been in my family for 70 years based on information that's almost certainly fraudulent. Either you show me that work order right now, or I call the county sheriff and report you for trespassing on private property. Your choice. I'll wait. He showed me the work order. Vendor Home Survey Solutions. The company name alone told me everything I needed to know. Patricia's ex-husband had been in real estate development. Real estate development means construction. Construction means surveying. And sure enough, a quick Google search on my phone confirmed that Vendor Home Survey Solutions was owned by Marcus Vanderhome, Patricia's ex-brother-in-law, her former husband's brother, and apparently the only surveyor in Arizona willing to produce whatever property boundaries Patricia needed to support her delusions. The work order was dated November 10th, 4 days ago. It requested a comprehensive boundary survey of Meadowbrook Estates' southern common area with specific attention to encroachment analysis of adjacent private property and improvements. Translation: find a way to make it look like my fence line was on HOA land so Patricia could claim I owed them money and compliance. I took photos of everything: the work order, the survey crew, every single stake they'd planted. Then I went inside, made some phone calls, and by 9 a.m. I had a county surveyor scheduled to conduct an independent survey that afternoon using the original 1952 property plat, the 1978 county verification, and the 2003 boundary confirmation my father had commissioned when the development first broke ground. Patricia's survey crew finished their work by noon. They packed up their equipment, pulled their stakes, and left me with a preliminary findings document that claimed my fence line was 15.7 feet onto what they designated as HOA Common Land Parcel 7B. The document included calculations, measurements, GPS coordinates, and enough technical jargon to sound legitimate if you didn't know what you were looking at. I knew what I was looking at. I was looking at fraud. The county surveyor arrived at 2 p.m. His name was Robert Chen, no relation to me, just one of those coincidences that makes you believe in cosmic timing. And he'd been doing boundary surveys in this county for 37 years. He'd actually worked on some of the original Meadowbrook Estates plats, which made him exactly the right person for this job. Robert took one look at Patricia's survey and started laughing. Not polite chuckling, full on, bent over, wiping tears from his eyes. I'm sorry, he managed after a minute. I shouldn't laugh, but this is either the worst survey work I've ever seen or it's deliberately fraudulent. I'm leaning toward the second one. Walk me through it. Pretend I don't know anything about surveying, which was mostly true. I knew federal housing law, not property boundary technicalities. Robert pulled out his equipment and started walking the fence line, explaining as he went. The original 1952 property boundary was marked by a series of iron rebar stakes driven deep into the ground, each one surveyed and documented when my grandfather first registered the property. Those stakes were still there, exactly where they'd been for 70 years, and my fence ran precisely along that boundary line. Patricia's surveyor had simply ignored them, used different reference points, and shifted the entire boundary measurement to create the appearance of encroachment. See this? Robert pointed to a rusted iron stake barely visible in the hard pan. This is your southeast corner marker. It's referenced in every deed, every plat, every legal document associated with this property since 1952. It's not moving. It hasn't moved. And your fence is exactly 3 inches inside your property line, which means you've got a 3-inch buffer of your own land that you're not even using. So I'm not encroaching on anything. You're not even close to encroaching. He pulled out his laser measurement tool and started marking distances. But here's where it gets interesting. You know that decorative entrance monument at the Meadowbrook Estate's main gate, the one with all the stonework and the community name carved into it? I knew it. Everyone knew it. It was Patricia's pride and joy, installed during her first year as president as part of her Community Enhancement Initiative that had cost the HOA nearly $85,000 in special assessments. That monument, Robert continued, is sitting 4 feet and 2 inches onto your property. It's not on HOA land, it's not on county easement, it's on your land, and it's been there for 2.5 years without your permission. The smile that spread across my face must have looked slightly unhinged because Robert took a step back. You're telling me, I said slowly, that while Patricia is claiming I'm encroaching on her property, her HOA has been encroaching on mine this entire time. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And unlike your fence, which is inside your boundary, their monument is well past theirs. This is textbook adverse possession territory, except they haven't been there long enough to claim any rights. You could demand they remove it tomorrow, and legally, they'd have to comply. I thought about that monument. The way Patricia had fawned over it at the dedication ceremony, the photos she'd posted on the HOA website, the little speeches she'd given about community pride and establishing our identity. She'd probably driven past it twice a day for 2.5 years, never once thinking to verify that it was actually on HOA property. Because people like Patricia don't verify things. They just assume they're right and expect everyone else to fall in line. Robert finished his survey by 5 p.m. The official document confirmed everything. My fence was properly positioned on my property. Patricia's survey was garbage, and the HOA had been trespassing on my land since 2021. He handed me 3 copies of his findings, certified and stamped, admissible in any court in the country. You planning to fight this? He asked as he packed up his equipment. Oh, I'm planning to do more than fight it. I'm planning to make it a federal case study. He grinned. I've been doing surveys for almost 40 decades, and I've seen some HOA nonsense in my time. But this lady, she's something
favor of
special.
initiating immediate
She's trying to steal
eviction
your
proceedings
property
against
while
the Chen
trespassing
property.
on it. It takes
Patricia's
a
voice
particular
echoed
kind of
in the community
audacity.
center, amplified
Or
by the portable
stupidity.
microphone she'd insisted
In my
on
experience,
using,
it's usually
even
both.
though the room was barely 40 feet across.
Patricia's official
3 hands went up in unison, hers, Gary Hoffmeyer's, and Linda Chen's, 3 votes that she'd probably secured before the meeting even started. The motion passed unanimously, exactly as she'd planned. The 30 or so residents scattered through the folding chairs erupted in applause, some of them standing, all of them convinced they'd just witnessed democracy in action. I sat in the back row, silent, and let them celebrate. Let them think they'd won. Let Patricia bask in her moment of triumph while I held a manila folder containing enough evidence to end her presidency, her HOA, and possibly her freedom. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me take you back to the beginning of that meeting, because you need to understand exactly how Patricia orchestrated her own downfall, step by step, word by word, all of it captured on the recording device I'd legally placed on the mandatory sign-in table by the entrance. The meeting was scheduled for November 20th at 7 p.m. I arrived at 6:45, early enough to watch people file in, to see who was in Patricia's camp and who was just there out of obligation or curiosity. The Meadowbrook Estates Community Center was exactly what you'd expect. A converted amenity building with white walls, beige carpet, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look vaguely ill. Folding tables line one wall with coffee, store-bought cookies, and name tags for board members that look like they'd been printed at Office Depot. The sign-in table was positioned right by the entrance, mandatory attendance tracking for all residents.
I'd arrived early specifically to watch Patricia set it up, to see her place the clipboard and pen exactly so, to verify that my small digital recorder, disguised as a phone charging brick and plugged into the wall outlet directly behind the table, had a clear line of audio to capture everything that would be said in this room. Arizona is a one-party consent state. I only needed my own permission to record conversations I was part of. And since this was a mandatory meeting about my property, I was very much a party to everything that would happen here. Patricia arrived at 6:50, dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood HOA gathering. Navy blazer, pressed slacks, heels that clicked importantly on the linoleum floor. She had an oversized leather portfolio, a laptop, and that particular energy of someone who'd practiced their presentation multiple times in front of a mirror. She saw me sitting in the back row, and her expression flickered, just for a second, surprise mixed with something that might have been concern, before she recovered and gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, I'm glad you decided to attend. Shows good faith." I nodded but didn't respond, just settled deeper into my chair, the manila folder resting casually on my lap. Gary and Linda arrived together at 6:55. Both of them looking uncomfortable in business casual attire, both of them carrying matching folders that probably contained whatever talking points Patricia had prepared for them. They took their seats at the head table, arranged their papers, and avoided making eye contact with anyone in the audience. By 7 p.m., roughly 35 residents had filtered in. I recognized most of them from the neighborhood Facebook group, Patricia's supporters, the ones who commented enthusiastically on her enforcement posts, who praised her tough stance on violations, who genuinely believed she was protecting their property values by terrorizing anyone who didn't conform. They sat in the front rows, chatting quietly, checking their phones, waiting for the show to start. A few others sat scattered toward the back, people I didn't recognize, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Mandatory meeting meant mandatory attendance, and Patricia tracked it ruthlessly. Miss a meeting? Get a fine. Simple as that. At 7:03, Patricia called the meeting to order, banged a gavel she'd bought from Amazon that looked ridiculous but sounded official. The room quieted. "Thank you all for attending this emergency board meeting. We have several important matters to address tonight, but our primary focus will be enforcement actions regarding a property that continues to violate multiple community standards despite repeated attempts at resolution." She didn't say my name. Didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. I could feel eyes turning toward me, subtle glances, whispers barely concealed. "We've attempted resolution through normal channels. We've offered compliance assistance. We have extended deadlines. We have tried to work with this property owner. But tolerance without compliance is not kindness. It's enabling. And I refuse to enable behavior that damages our community." More applause. Gary and Linda nodded along like dashboard ornaments. Patricia clicked to a new slide. This one showed the fabricated survey from her ex-brother-in-law's company, complete with measurements, boundary lines, and official-looking stamps that meant absolutely nothing given the document's fraudulent nature. Recent surveying has revealed that this property is also encroaching on HOA common land, 15.7 feet of unauthorized fence line occupying space that belongs to all of us collectively. This isn't just a standards violation anymore. This is property theft. Property theft. She had actually said it. Called my lawful fence, installed on my property, documented for 70 years, property theft. The audacity was almost impressive. The HOA board has consulted with legal counsel. This was a lie. Bradley Whitmore had withdrawn 2 days after our meeting in my living room, and Patricia hadn't found a replacement, but nobody in this room knew that. We've been advised that we have grounds to pursue immediate enforcement action, including but not limited to property liens, court-ordered compliance, and if necessary, eminent domain proceedings to acquire the encroaching land for community use. Eminent domain. She had said it. Out loud, in front of witnesses, on my recording. Eminent domain is a government power that allows the taking of private property for public use with just compensation. It requires legitimate public purpose,
fair market value payment, and extensive legal proceedings. HOAs don't have eminent domain authority. They can't just decide they want your land and take it. That's not how any of this works. But Patricia had just claimed that power in front of 35 witnesses and a recording device that was capturing every word. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Patricia said, her voice dropping to that tone people use when they want to sound reluctantly serious about something they're actually excited about. "The board is prepared to pursue the maximum enforcement action available under our governing documents in Arizona law. This property has been a thorn in our community's side for too long. It's time to either bring it into compliance or remove it from our neighborhood entirely." The room was silent now. Even her supporters looked uncomfortable with that last part. Remove it from our neighborhood entirely, as if she could just erase my family's 70-year-old ranch because it offended her sense of suburban order. "Before we vote on enforcement proceedings, I want to give the property owner one final opportunity to address the board. Ms. Chen, would you like to address these findings?" This was my cue, my moment to defend myself, to beg for mercy, to negotiate some kind of settlement that would let Patricia claim victory while I avoided total destruction. That's what she expected, what everyone in this room expected. I stood up slowly, gathering my manila folder, and walked toward the front of the room. My boots were still dusty from morning chores. My jeans had a small tear at the knee. I was wearing my grandfather's old ranch jacket, the one with his name embroidered on the chest, the one that smelled like hay and horses and 70 years of honest work. I reached the front, turned to face the audience, and said nothing. Just stood there, silent, watching Patricia's expression shift from confident to confused to increasingly uncomfortable as the seconds ticked past. "Miss Chen," she prompted, "did you want to address the board?" I opened my manila folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it on the table in front of her. It was Robert Chen's certified survey, the one proving my fence was exactly where it belonged and her monument was trespassing on my property. Then I turned and walked back to my seat in the last row. Didn't say a word. Didn't explain. Just let that document sit there while Patricia picked it up, scanned it, and realized that I'd just publicly called her bluff without saying a single thing. This is a different survey," she stammered. "We have our own professional assessment that clearly shows—" "Is that all Miss Chen wanted to present?" Linda interrupted, trying to move things along. Patricia recovered quickly. "Yes, apparently, which just demonstrates the lack of serious engagement we've experienced throughout this process." She set the survey aside like it was garbage. "The board will now vote on the proposed enforcement action. All in favor of initiating immediate eviction proceedings, property liens, and legal action to recover encroachment damages." 3 hands rose. The motion passed unanimously. The room applauded again, louder this time, energized by Patricia's performance and the decisive action she had promised. "Meeting adjourned. Enforcement procedures will begin immediately. Ms. Chen will receive formal notification of legal proceedings within 5 business days." People started gathering their things, chatting excitedly, congratulating Patricia on finally taking action. I sat in the back row, silent, watching it all unfold, and quietly removed the recording device from behind the sign-in table on my way out. 47 minutes of footage. Patricia claiming eminent domain. "You're under federal investigation, Patricia." That was the line that detonated in her perfect suburban kingdom like a depth charge, and I didn't have to say it out loud. The envelope had already spoken for me. Her reaction wasn't subtle. At first, she blinked, as if trying to reset her vision, like the words couldn't possibly mean what they spelled out in stark black serif. Then her lips pulled back tight, the way a cornered animal bares its teeth. I watched every twitch, every tremor, from the comfort of my porch chair. The steam from my coffee curled upward, blurring my view of her, as though the scene itself were happening behind a one-way mirror. You ever witness someone's entire empire collapse in the span of 30 seconds? Let me tell you, It doesn't come with explosions or alarms. It comes in the quiet gasp of a woman who thought she was untouchable. Her manicured fingers fumbled the stapled packet, eyes darting across phrases she'd probably never imagined seeing in connection with her own name. Fraudulent surveying practices, improper lien placements, harassment of a protected resident. Each phrase was a hammer, and I could almost hear her bones vibrating with every blow. The neighborhood itself seemed to pause. Lawn sprinklers hissed in their arcs. A delivery truck idled at the corner, driver scrolling his phone, oblivious. And Patricia, the woman who had written fines on the backs of napkins, who had screamed about paint shades being unauthorized deviations from approved palettes, who once threatened to tow my car because the license plate frame didn't match community aesthetics. Patricia looked like she had just been handed a death sentence. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, I sipped my coffee, knowing full well she'd eventually look up, and when she did, the silence between us wasn't silence at all. It was judgment. It was inevitability. 17 minutes later, the silence shattered. The growl of her golf cart rattled down the street, faster than I'd ever seen her drive it. The little electric motor whined, almost panicked, like it knew the fury it carried. She swerved onto my curb, barely braking, practically leaping out before it had stopped moving. Her visor was askew, hair sprayed into place but fraying at the edges in defiance of her control. She clutched the letter in one hand like evidence, like a weapon, like something she wanted to shred into dust and scatter into the wind. "What is this?" she barked before her shoes even hit my driveway. I set my mug down carefully on the porch rail. "It looks like official correspondence," I said evenly. Her eyes darted to the return address. Federal Housing Oversight Commission, Office of Residential Governance. She jabbed her finger at it like she could stab through paper. You think you can fake this? You think you can just print out some bogus legal garbage and scare me?" I tilted my head. "Do you really think I'd put that much effort into a prank?" Her lips curled back. "Connections. That's what this is. I knew you had someone on the inside. Nobody just does this. She swallowed, the letter trembling in her grip. You can't shut down an HOA with a single complaint." I stood, slow enough that she took an instinctive half-step back. "You'd be surprised," I said softly. Let me rewind, because this wasn't just about a letter. The roots of this moment stretched back months. Patricia had built Meadowbrook Estates into her personal fiefdom. She treated the bylaws like scripture and herself as the sole interpreter. She'd bully the board into rubber-stamping her vendettas, then wave enforcement letters like Holy Writ. And if you challenged her, she'd remind you of the clause buried deep in Section 8.3. Board authority is presumed valid absent judicial review. Most neighbors folded. They paid their fines, repainted their shutters, bent their backs to her will. But me, I didn't fold. 3 weeks earlier, she had attempted her boldest play yet, a boundary survey adjustment that miraculously shifted my property line 6 feet inward. That 6 feet gave her HOA jurisdiction over my detached garage, which she immediately deemed non-compliant. She issued me a $3,200 violation notice and scheduled a board hearing conveniently without my presence. It was the kind of power grab that made enemies, but Patricia didn't care. She never believed she'd be caught. What she didn't know was that I'd been documenting her every move, every fine, every letter, every whispered threat delivered at block parties. I'd filed FOIA requests for county zoning maps, dug through state databases for nonprofit compliance filings, and even requested IRS 990 forms to see where Meadowbrook's money went. And then I took it all, every damning detail, and sent it to the one agency she'd never heard of, the Federal Housing Oversight Commission. Most people don't even know it exists. It's a tiny office buried in bureaucracy, designed to intervene when HOAs cross into illegal territory. Rarely invoked, almost mythic. but Patricia's arrogance gave me a case file thick enough to wake them from hibernation. So when she stood in my driveway waving that letter like a shield, I knew exactly what it meant. The game board had flipped. "Tell me right now what you did," she hissed. I met her eyes. "Patricia, let's not play games. You know exactly what you did, and now so does the federal government." Her voice cracked just for a second. This will ruin me. Do you understand that? They'll audit my accounts, She cut herself off, realizing too late she'd said too much. And there it was, the first crack in her porcelain mask. She wasn't worried about the neighborhood. She wasn't worried about Meadowbrook. She was worried about herself. "You brought this on yourself," I told her. For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of cicadas in the late morning heat. Then she leaned closer, her perfume sharp, her words almost a whisper. "You don't know who you're messing with." I smiled. Finally, the mask could come off. "Neither do you." Her face drained as I extended my hand, not for a handshake, but as a gesture of introduction. "Deputy Director Sarah Chen, Office of Residential Governance. I supervise the very department that decides whether HOAs like yours deserve to exist at all." She staggered back a step, clutching the letter tighter. I could see the math happening in her head, every threat she had ever made, every fine she had ever fabricated, every dollar skimmed from community dues, and now the possibility that it was all about to unravel, not in whispers at the cul-de-sac, but in federal court. Her voice came out hoarse. This isn't over." "Of course it isn't," I said, calm as ever. "This is only the beginning." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her golf cart. The tire squealed against the pavement as she tore off down the street, the sound echoing between the manicured lawns like a warning bell. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, curiosity flashing in their half-hidden faces. They didn't know what they just witnessed, but they knew enough to sense the power shift. I picked up my coffee again, still warm, and took a slow sip. My hands didn't shake, my pulse didn't race, because I'd been waiting for this morning, waiting for her perfect world to fracture under the weight of its own corruption. And yet, as the hum of her golf cart faded into the silence, I couldn't shake the question that settled into the silence. What would Patricia do next? Because women like her, they don't go quietly. They scheme, they retaliate, they claw back with everything they've got. And I had no doubt that the next move she made would test the limits of what even federal oversight could control.